The alarm had been screaming for 11 seconds when I reached the bridge, and in those 11 seconds the entire trajectory of my life folded in on itself like a map being crumpled in a fist. I could still smell the coffee I had dropped in the corridor. I could still feel the wet heat of it soaking through my sleeve. But those details belonged to a version of me that no longer existed, because the version of me that stumbled through the blast doors and grabbed the railing above the tactical pit was someone who had just read the sensor feed, and the sensor feed said 4,200 warships had dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of our solar system. Captain Henry Graves stood at the center of the bridge with his hands clasped behind his back, and he was not moving. That was the thing about Graves. When everything around him caught fire, he became stone. His jaw was set, his eyes were fixed on the main display, and the only sign that he registered my arrival was a slight tilt of his head. "Navigation, confirm the count," he said. Peter Grant, hunched over his console with both hands flat on the glass, spoke without looking up. 4,213 vessels confirmed. 12 supercapital class. 47 heavy carriers. The rest are cruisers, destroyers, and escort frigates. Formation is standard Thesari spearhead. They are decelerating toward the inner system. I took my station at the intelligence console and pulled up the long-range feed. The display painted the incoming fleet as a dense cloud of red markers, each one tagged with tonnage and energy signature, and the cloud was so thick it looked like a wound in the star map. I had studied Thesari fleet doctrine for 9 years. I had written 3 classified papers on their tactical patterns. I had wargamed a dozen scenarios where they projected force into contested space. None of those scenarios looked like this, because none of them involved the Thesari committing their entire active battle fleet to a single operation. This was not a show of force. This was an extinction-level response. "They brought everything," I said, and I did not mean for my voice to sound the way it did. Laura Bennett, our weapons officer, looked up from her station across the pit. She was calm, but her fingers were white on the edge of her console. "Everything and then some. That formation includes ships from their reserve yards. Some of those energy signatures match vessels that were listed as decommissioned 3 years ago. They pulled mothballed warships out of storage for this." Owen Clark, our tactical officer, leaned forward and traced a line across his display with one finger. "The formation geometry is interesting. They have got their heavies stacked in 3 echelons, each one capable of independent fire coordination. If they lose the command layer, the second echelon takes over. If they lose that, the third picks up. This is not just a fleet. This is a redundant system. They planned for losses. They planned for us to fight back," I said. "They planned for something to fight back," Owen corrected. "I do not think they planned for us specifically. I think they planned for the worst thing they could imagine, and that tells me they are nervous." Graves did not blink. "Time to engagement range." "At current deceleration, 14 hours, Peter said. 14 hours. I thought about what 14 hours meant. It meant that somewhere in the vast cold between Jupiter and Saturn, where our ship sat in the silent dark, we had 14 hours to prepare for a fight that every strategic model said we could not win, not because we lack the will, but because the mathematics of conventional warfare do not bend. 4,000 ships against 1 ship is not a battle. It is arithmetic. But our ship was not conventional, and the mathematics it operated on were not the kind they taught in any academy the galaxy had ever built. I had been aboard what the crew simply called the Dreadnought for 3 years, and in those 3 years I had never fully understood what I was standing inside. The ship was massive, nearly 2 kilometers from bow to stern, but its mass readings were impossible. The density of the hull material suggested something that should collapse under its own gravity, yet the ship moved through space with an agility that contradicted every law of inertia I had ever learned. The corridors were wide and well lit. The crew quarters were comfortable. The mess hall served decent food. From the inside, it felt like any other large vessel. It was only when you looked at the data, when you really looked, that you realized you were living inside something that should not exist. The hull was composed of a material that our engineering team had synthesized at the atomic level, a lattice of exotic matter that did not appear on any periodic table and did not obey the thermodynamic rules that governed every other substance in known space. Daniel Holt, our chief engineer, once told me that describing the hull material in terms of existing physics was like trying to describe color to someone who had never seen light. The vocabulary did not exist. The concepts did not map. You could point at the math and say, "This is what it does," but you could not say, "This is what it is," because the category it belonged to had not been invented yet. The power core was not a reactor in any traditional sense. It was something closer to a controlled tear in the fabric of spacetime itself. A wound that bled energy in quantities that made stellar output look modest. Daniel monitored it the way a zookeeper monitors a sleeping dragon, with respect and constant vigilance, and the quiet understanding that the thing he was tending was fundamentally beyond his ability to control if it decided to be uncontrollable. And the weapon system, the single weapon system. Simon Price, our chief scientist, once described it to me as a conversation with the fundamental forces, before he stopped talking and stared at the wall for a very long time. I had pressed him on it. He had tried to explain. He used words like resonance cascade, and bond frequency modulation, and coherent field negation, and every word was technically precise and collectively meaningless to anyone who did not already understand the underlying theory, which was approximately 7 people on the entire ship, and, as far as we knew, 7 people in the entire galaxy. What I did understand, what all of us understood in the gut-level way that you understand gravity, or heat, or the sharpness of a blade, was that when the weapon fired, something terrible and unprecedented would happen, and that we were 14 hours away from finding out exactly what. Catherine Wells, our communications officer, broke the silence. I am receiving a broadband transmission from the lead Thesari vessel. It is the flagship. They are identifying it as the Throne of Silence. The transmission is on all standard diplomatic frequencies. Put it through, Graves said. The voice that filled the bridge was deep and resonant, translated in real time by our linguistic systems, and it carried the particular flavor of contempt that the Thesari had elevated to an art form. It was their supreme commander, the one our intelligence files identified as High Marshal Drawn. He spoke as if he were addressing children who had wandered into a restricted area and needed to be escorted back to where they belonged. Terran vessel, you are alone. Your species has been given every opportunity to accept the protection of the Thesari Dominion and to cede the territories that are rightfully ours by conquest doctrine. You have refused. You have been warned. You have been given time to reconsider. That time is over. Your single warship, however impressive it may seem to you, does not alter the reality of your position. You are one. We are thousands. Stand down your systems, power down your weapons, and prepare to be boarded. If you comply, your crew will be treated with dignity, appropriate to a subjugated species. If you do not, you will be treated as debris. You have 1 hour to respond. The transmission ended. The bridge was quiet except for the low hum of the power core beneath our feet. A sound that was not quite sound, more like a vibration in the bones, a reminder that we were sitting on top of something that pulsed with the heartbeat of physics itself. Laura let out a slow breath. Dignity appropriate to a subjugated species. That is a new one. It is standard Thesari diplomatic language for conquest scenarios, I said. It means they will allow surviving populations to continue existing in a servile capacity. Laborers, resource extractors, living tools. Generous of them, Owen said flatly. Graves looked at me. Full assessment. I pulled up everything I had. 9 years of analysis, compressed into the few minutes that mattered. The Thesari do not bluff. Their culture does not contain the concept. Deception in warfare is considered a sign of weakness in their doctrine. What you see is what they are. 4,200 ships, crewed by approximately 900,000 combat personnel, supported by a logistics chain that extends back to their core systems. Their fleet doctrine requires overwhelming force for contested annexations, and they consider anything less than a 10-to-1 advantage to be a fair fight. 4,000-to-1 is their way of saying, they take us seriously enough to be thorough. Do they know what we have? Graves asked. No, sir. Our technology base has been classified beyond any level they could penetrate. Their intelligence services are good, among the best in the galaxy, but the theoretical framework underlying our systems is so far outside their scientific paradigm that even if they obtained raw data, they would not be able to interpret it. They know we built something large. They have detected energy signatures from the construction phase, but their analysts have concluded, based on their own technological framework, that whatever we built is at best a heavily armed defensive platform, a fortress, something that can absorb punishment and make an invasion expensive. They do not have the theoretical foundation to imagine what the weapon actually does. Nobody does. Owen tapped his console, which means their tactical approach will be standard siege doctrine, close to weapons range, establish a perimeter, and pour sustained fire into the target until it breaks. They are expecting a war of attrition, a slugfest. They are expecting us to die slowly, Laura said. They are prepared to spend days grinding us down. Graves nodded slowly. He turned to Laura. Status of the primary system. Laura's hands moved across her console, with the practiced ease of someone who had run these checks 1,000 times in simulation and was now running them for the first time for real. Primary weapon is charged and stable. Targeting array is online. Calibration is within 0.03% of optimal. I can fire on your command at any time. Single shot, adjustable yield, adjustable targeting cone. Simon, Graves said, turning to the science station where Simon Price sat, surrounded by displays showing data streams I could not begin to interpret. Rivers of numbers and symbols that flowed across his screens, like a language spoken by the universe to itself. Give me your honest assessment. One shot. What happens? Simon pushed his glasses up his nose. He was the only person on the bridge who looked neither frightened nor calm. He looked fascinated, the way a mathematician looks when they are about to test a proof they have spent their life constructing and never had the opportunity or the desire to validate in the real world. The weapon operates on a principle that does not have a name in any language currently spoken in the galaxy, he said. The closest analogy I can offer is this. Every structure in the universe, from an atom to a star to a warship, is held together by fundamental forces. Strong nuclear force, weak nuclear force, electromagnetism, gravity. These forces are not random. They follow rules. They operate at specific frequencies, if you will permit me the metaphor. Our weapon does not overpower those rules. It does not fight against them. It speaks to them. It introduces a counter-frequency, for lack of a better term, that tells the bonds holding a target together to simply let go. Matter does not explode. It does not burn. It does not undergo any violent process. It releases. Every molecule returns to its component parts simultaneously and peacefully. The process is instant and total within the targeting field. He paused, chose his next words carefully. One shot, properly calibrated, will dissolve the molecular structure of every object within the targeting cone. The cone can be narrowed to a single vessel, or widened to encompass a formation. The energy cost is remarkably low because we are not adding force. We are removing cohesion. Think of it as the difference between knocking down a wall with a battering ram and simply removing the mortar between the bricks. One requires enormous energy. The other requires only understanding. He paused again. I have modeled the maximum effective range at this power level. It extends well beyond the boundaries of this solar system. The bridge was silent. I had heard Simon explain the weapon before, in briefings and in late-night conversations over cups of tea in the mess hall. But hearing it now, with 4,000 warships bearing down on us, the words landed differently. They landed like stones dropped into deep water, sending ripples through assumptions I had not even known I was holding. Daniel Holt, our chief engineer, spoke from the engineering station at the rear of the bridge. He was a big man with thick hands and a voice like gravel, the kind of engineer who had oil under his fingernails and poetry in his head, and kept both at a professional distance. I want to be clear about something, Captain. I have run every diagnostic we have, full spectrum, every system, every subsystem, every backup and fail-safe. The power core is operating at 6% capacity. 6%. The weapon is charged and ready at 6%. The hull is at full integrity at 6%. Life support, sensors, navigation, communications, all of it running at 6%. What we are about to do, whatever it is, we are doing it while barely awake. This ship has never been pushed past single-digit output. I do not know what happens at full power because we have never needed to find out, and frankly the numbers scare me, and I am not a man who scares easily. Graves absorbed this. He let the information settle into the silence of the bridge, where every crew member heard it and understood its implications, without needing them explained. Our ship, the most powerful object ever constructed by human hands, was idling. Everything it had done, everything it was about to do, would be accomplished at a fraction of its capacity. The full potential of the Dreadnought was not something we had tested, because testing it would have required a scale of demonstration that we were not prepared to make. Not yet. Not ever, if we had any choice in the matter. Catherine, Graves said, open a channel, all frequencies, every relay in range. I want this heard by everyone with an antenna. Catherine nodded. Her fingers moved across her console. Channel open, sir. Broadcasting on all diplomatic, military, and civilian frequencies. Signal will reach the nearest conclave relay in approximately 40 minutes. Graves straightened. He was not a tall man. He was not physically imposing. He did not have the chiseled jaw or the commanding presence that military propaganda liked to paint on its recruitment posters. He was average height, lean, with gray at his temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of too many late nights and too many hard decisions. But in that moment, standing in the center of the bridge with the weight of the entire human species on his shoulders, he seemed to fill the room, not with sighs, with certainty. He spoke one word. No. Catherine transmitted it. One word, broadcast on every frequency the Thesari were monitoring, on every diplomatic channel the galactic community used, on every relay that connected our solar system to the broader network of civilizations that had spent the last 40 years dismissing humanity as a curiosity, a footnote, a minor species of no strategic consequence. Number. Not we refuse your terms, not we will fight, not we reject your authority. No qualifiers, no elaboration, no posturing, just the word itself. Complete, final, the most human thing I had ever heard, because it contained within its 2 letters everything we were. The refusal to submit, the refusal to be less than what we knew ourselves to be, the refusal to accept a galaxy where the strong devoured the weak simply because they could. I watched the tactical display. For a long moment, nothing changed. The red cloud hung at the edge of the system, decelerating, waiting. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, the formation tightened, accelerated. The red cloud became an arrow, and the arrow pointed at us. They had received our answer, and they had chosen theirs. Graves sat down in his command chair. All stations, battle readiness. Nobody fires until I give the word. I want the record to be absolutely clear. We did not start this. Understood, Laura said, and her voice was steady as bedrock. Weapons on standby, waiting for your command. And so we waited. Those 14 hours were the longest of my life, and I have lived through things that would make most people forget their own names. I spent part of them reviewing intelligence files, cross-referencing fleet compositions, updating threat assessments that felt increasingly theoretical given the nature of what we were about to do. I spent part of them staring at the sensor feed, watching 4,000 warships crawl toward us across the solar system with the inexorable patience of a tide, and I spent part of them sitting alone in my quarters, trying to write a letter to my brother that I could not finish because I did not know whether I was writing a farewell or a victory note, and the uncertainty made every word feel like a lie. I wrote, "Dear Matthew, by the time you read this," and I stopped, because I could not decide how that sentence ended. By the time you read this, everything will be different. By the time you read this, I will be dead. By the time you read this, we will have done something that cannot be undone. All 3 were true. None of them were things I wanted to put in a letter to my younger brother who still lived on Earth and taught history at a secondary school in Bristol, and had no idea that his older sibling was sitting inside a weapon that could dissolve worlds. I abandoned the letter and went to engineering instead. I do not know what drew me there. Maybe I wanted to see the power core with my own eyes, to stand in the presence of the thing that was going to determine whether we lived or died in the next few hours. Maybe I just wanted to talk to Daniel, who had a way of making impossible things sound like plumbing problems, and plumbing problems sound like the end of the world. Engineering was on the lowest habitable deck, buried deep in the ship's belly where the hum of the power core was not a background noise but a presence. You did not hear it so much as feel it in your teeth, in your ribs, in the spaces between your vertebrae. It was the kind of sound that made you aware of your own skeleton. Daniel was standing at the primary monitoring station, surrounded by a horseshoe of displays that showed the power core's output in dozens of different metrics. He had a wrench in one hand and a coffee mug in the other, and he was staring at a readout with the expression of a man who had been having the same argument with the same number for the last 3 hours. "You look like you are losing a debate with a decimal point," I said. He did not look up. "I have been running efficiency calculations on the absorption matrix. The hull is performing 12% above theoretical maximum, which should be impossible, because we defined the theoretical maximum based on the hull's actual measured performance, which means either our measurements were wrong, or the material is improving itself. Improving itself. Getting better at what it does. Learning, if you want to use that word for exotic matter, which I do not recommend, but which is the most accurate description I have." He finally looked at me. His eyes were tired but sharp. "This ship is not a machine the way you and I understand machines. A machine does what you build it to do. This ship does what the physics tells it to do. And the physics is deeper than our blueprints. We designed the hull to absorb energy. But the math describes a system that is, at its foundation, responsive in a way that our engineering vocabulary does not have a word for. Not biological, not conscious, but adaptive. It interacts with the universe at a level that our instruments can describe, but not explain. I leaned against the railing and looked down at the power core housing, a vast cylindrical structure that descended through multiple decks, wrapped in layers of monitoring equipment and safety systems that Daniel had once described as decorative, because if the core actually failed, no safety system ever conceived would make a meaningful difference. "Are you worried?" I asked. "About the core? No. The core is the most stable thing on this ship, possibly the most stable thing in this solar system. The energy output is smooth, the containment is perfect, and the weapon interface is clean." He took a sip of coffee. "I am worried about what happens after. Not to the ship, to us, to the crew, to everyone on this bridge who is about to watch something happen that no human being has ever watched before. The engineering is sound. I trust the engineering. It is the human element that keeps me up at night. 300,000 people, Daniel. I know. I ran those numbers too. I ran them before you did, because it is my job to know what the weapon does, and the weapon does not differentiate between a hull plate and a living being. It speaks to the forces, and the forces let go, and everything returns to what it was before it was assembled. Atoms, particles, the raw material of the universe, unstructured and dispersed. We stood there in the hum of the power core for a while, two men surrounded by technology that was beyond our ability to fully comprehend, waiting to use it on beings who could not comprehend it at all. "Daniel," I said, "if there was another way." "There is not. I have looked. I have spent 6 years looking for another way to demonstrate this technology that does not involve directing it at living targets. A controlled demonstration on an asteroid, a proof of concept in empty space. None of them work. An asteroid turning to dust can be dismissed as a trick, as sensor manipulation, as a carefully staged performance. The only demonstration that cannot be denied is the one where the threat is real, and the response is real, and everyone watching knows that neither side was pretending." He was right. I knew he was right. The Thesari would not have believed anything less. Their culture did not have a framework for abstract demonstrations of power. In Thesari philosophy, power only existed in its application. A weapon that had never been fired was not a weapon. It was a decoration. You could break 1,000 asteroids and they would dismiss it as target practice. The only thing they would accept as proof of capability was the capability itself, exercised against a target that mattered. That was the trap. A galaxy that only understood the language of force required you to speak it, and speaking it required doing the thing you had spent your entire existence trying to avoid. I left engineering and went to the mess hall. It was nearly empty. A few crew members sat at scattered tables, eating without tasting, talking without hearing, going through the motions of normalcy, while the clock ticked down above them. I got a cup of coffee and sat by myself, and thought about how we had gotten here. Not just to this moment, with a hostile fleet bearing down on our only home, but to the larger situation, how humanity had stumbled onto the galactic stage 40 years ago, wide-eyed and full of questions, and found a galaxy that operated on principles we recognized all too well. Hierarchy, dominance, the strong eat the weak. We had seen that story before. We had lived it. We had nearly destroyed ourselves with it. And when we looked up at the stars and saw the same pattern repeating on a cosmic scale, we made a decision. We would not play that game. Not again. Not ever. For 40 years we traded, we collaborated, we shared, and we smiled. We sent diplomats who listened more than they spoke. We sent scientists who asked questions instead of making demands. We sent cultural attachés who spent years learning alien art forms and musical traditions and philosophical frameworks, not because they were useful, but because they were beautiful, and because we believed that beauty was worth crossing the stars for. We built relationships with species that mocked us to our faces, and we thanked them for the conversation. The galaxy thought we were weak. The galaxy thought we were afraid. The galaxy thought our kindness was the last refuge of a species that had no other options. The galaxy was wrong. While our diplomats smiled, our physicists were rewriting the fundamental equations that described reality. Not in secret, exactly. The research was published. The papers were available. But the findings were so far outside the galaxy's accepted scientific paradigm that they were dismissed as errors, or curiosities, or the confused ramblings of a young species that did not yet understand how the universe actually worked. We submitted papers to galactic journals and received polite rejection letters. We presented at conferences and were directed to introductory courses. We offered collaborations and were told that our methodology was fundamentally flawed. We were trying to share what we knew. Nobody wanted it. While our traders bartered for goods we did not strictly need, our engineers were testing materials that should not exist. While our ambassadors accepted insults with grace, our shipwrights were assembling something in the shadow of Saturn that represented not just a leap in military technology, but a complete departure from the way every civilization in the galaxy understood the universe. Not an incremental advance, a paradigm shift, a reclassification of what was possible. We did not build the Dreadnought because we wanted to fight. We built it because we understood, with the bone-deep certainty of a species that had clawed its way back from the edge of self-destruction more times than we could count, that kindness without strength is just another word for waiting to be devoured. We had hoped we would never need to use it. We had spent 40 years trying to prove that coexistence was possible, that the galaxy's hierarchy of force could be replaced with something better, that power did not have to mean dominance. The Thesari had decided otherwise, and now we sat in the dark between planets, one ship against thousands, waiting for the moment when hope gave way to physics. I found myself at the observation port on Deck 7 as the final hours wound down. The stars were steady and cold, indifferent to everything happening in the tiny pocket of space where I stood. I could see Jupiter in the distance, a pale marble hanging in the void, and somewhere beyond it, Saturn, where the construction yards that had birthed our ship now stood empty and dark. I pressed my forehead against the glass and closed my eyes and tried to feel something other than the sick weight of what was coming. A voice behind me said, "You cannot sleep either." I turned. It was Margaret Shaw, the admiral who had overseen the Dreadnought program from its inception. She was 63 years old, silver-haired, and carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had made decisions that altered the course of history and lost sleep over every single one of them. She was not technically part of the ship's crew. She had come aboard 3 days ago when intelligence confirmed the Thesari mobilization, arriving on a shuttle from Earth with a single bag and an expression that suggested she had been expecting this moment for a very long time. She said she wanted to see it through. I think she needed to. "No, ma'am," I said. "I cannot sleep." She stood beside me at the port and looked out at the stars. "I remember when we laid the first structural beam," she said. 17 years ago. I stood in the construction bay in orbit around Titan and watched the fabrication arms lower it into place, and I thought, this is either the most important thing humanity has ever built or the most dangerous mistake we have ever made. I still do not know which. I suspect I never will. "Maybe both," I said. She almost smiled. "Maybe both. That does seem to be our specialty as a species, holding two contradictory truths at the same time and refusing to let go of either one." We stood there for a while without speaking, watching the stars, feeling the hum of the power core through the soles of our feet. There is something about standing at the edge of an abyss that strips away everything non-essential. Small talk becomes impossible. Pretense becomes exhausting. You are left with the raw fact of your existence and the raw question of what it means, and neither one has an easy answer. "I met the Thesari High Marshal once," Margaret said, 20 years ago, at a diplomatic reception on the Conclave Station. He was a junior officer then, part of a military delegation that was there to observe, not to participate. But he stood out. He had a way of watching people that reminded me of a hawk studying a field, patient, calculating, deciding. He looked at me the way a predator looks at something it has not decided whether to eat yet. She paused, remembering. I smiled at him and asked about his family. He told me the Thesari do not have families in the way we understand them. They have lineages, duty lines, obligation structures. The concept of loving someone simply because they exist, with no expectation of return and no strategic value, was in his words sentimental weakness, a flaw that natural selection should have corrected long ago. She turned to me. I have thought about that conversation every day since, not because it angered me, but because it made me sad. Imagine building an entire civilization, a powerful civilization, a civilization that spans 1,000 star systems and commands the largest fleet in the galaxy, and building it on the idea that caring for someone is a deficiency, that compassion is a mistake, that the only relationship worth having is the one where you have the upper hand. And now he is coming to destroy us because we would not submit to that civilization, I said. Yes. He is a high marshal now. He commands their entire fleet. And he is bringing it here because we said no. And no one has ever said no to the Thesari and survived to repeat it. We are going to change that. She looked at me for a long moment. Are you afraid? Yes. Good. Fear means you understand what is at stake. The people I worry about are the ones who are not afraid, because they have either stopped thinking or they have stopped caring, and both of those things get people killed. She left me at the port. I watched the stars a while longer, and then I went back to the bridge because the clock was running out, and there was nowhere else I wanted to be, and no one else I wanted to be with. The final hours collapsed into minutes, with the sudden cruelty of time under pressure. The Thesari fleet crossed the orbit of Neptune, then Uranus, each boundary marker ticking past on the tactical display like a countdown to something that had no name yet. I watched the red cloud sharpen and resolve into individual signatures, thousands of them, each one a warship crewed by soldiers who believed absolutely in the rightness of their cause and the inevitability of their victory. They had numbers, they had firepower, they had the momentum of a civilization that had never lost a war in its entire recorded history spanning 6,000 years of continuous military expansion. We had one ship, one weapon, one shot. Peter called out range markers in a steady voice that did not waver even as the numbers shrank. Outer engagement envelope in 20 minutes. Thesari formation is shifting to assault configuration. Lead elements are deploying screening vessels. I count 300 fast attack craft moving to forward positions. Owen studied the formation with the focused intensity of a chess player reading a board. They are deploying a standard Thesari assault screen. The fast attack craft will probe our defenses and draw fire while the main body closes to optimal range for their heavy batteries. It is textbook. It is exactly what their doctrine says to do against a fixed defensive position. They think we are a fortress, I said, a static target that will try to weather their assault. They think we are a fortress that will eventually crack under sustained bombardment, Owen confirmed. Their entire tactical plan is built on the assumption that we have a breaking point. Apply enough force for long enough, and everything breaks. That is the fundamental axiom of Thesari military philosophy. Laura said quietly. They are about to discover a new axiom. On the tactical display, I could see the fleet reorganizing itself like a living thing, the massive carriers settling into the center of the formation, while rings of cruisers and destroyers spread outward to create layered fields of fire. The flagship, the Throne of Silence, sat at the geometric heart of the formation, surrounded by a personal guard of 40 heavy escorts. It was the largest warship anyone in the galaxy had ever built, a vessel so massive that it generated its own measurable gravitational influence on nearby ships. The Thesari had designed it to be a statement, a physical embodiment of their doctrine that might makes right. Its hull was covered in ceremonial engravings that told the history of Thesari conquest, in a language of victory that had no word for defeat. I pulled up the tactical comparison on my console. The Throne of Silence massed roughly 8 times what our Dreadnought massed. It carried over 2,000 individual weapon systems. Its crew complement was 90,000. In conventional terms, it outgunned us by a factor that my computer expressed in scientific notation because the regular numbers were too long. By every metric the galaxy used to measure military capability, we were outmatched so completely that the comparison was meaningless, like comparing a candle to a star. But the galaxy's metrics were wrong. They had always been wrong. They measured power in terms of how much energy you could throw at a target, how much armor you could stack between yourself and incoming fire, how many ships you could field and how many guns each ship carried. They measured the ability to destroy. They had never encountered a civilization that had moved past destruction entirely and arrived at something else, something that did not have a name, because no one had ever needed to name it before. Outer engagement envelope, Peter said. Thesari fleet is weapons hot. I am detecting power spikes across the entire formation. Every ship is charging primary batteries. Graves stood. All stations report. The reports came in crisp and professional, each department head confirming readiness with the practiced calm of people who had trained for this moment, even as they prayed it would never come. Laura confirmed weapons ready. Daniel confirmed power systems nominal at 6.2%. Simon confirmed targeting parameters locked and calibrated. Owen confirmed defensive posture set, though he added with a dry tone that he was not entirely sure what our defensive systems would need to defend against, given what Daniel had said about the hull. Helen Wright at the medical station confirmed all emergency protocols active, though she privately told me later that she had no idea what kind of injuries to prepare for in a battle that had no precedent. The hull will handle whatever they throw at us, Daniel said from engineering. I have run the simulations 11,000 times. 11,000. The material absorbs energy across the entire electromagnetic spectrum. Kinetic, thermal, electromagnetic, gravitational. It does not deflect. It does not resist. It absorbs. And it converts the absorbed energy to supplemental power for the core. In practical terms, shooting at us makes us stronger. They could fire everything they have for a week straight, and the only measurable effect would be a slight increase in our power reserves. I stared at my console. That was a detail I had known intellectually for 3 years but never internalized emotionally. The idea that an entire fleet's weapons fire would not just fail to damage us but would actively feed our power systems was the kind of concept that broke something in your head when you tried to hold it alongside everything the galaxy considered normal. They are hailing again, Catherine said. Let them talk, Graves said. The High Marshal's voice returned, and this time the contempt was laced with something harder. Something that might have been eagerness. Terran vessel, your refusal has been noted and entered into the record. You have chosen destruction. This is not negotiable. This is not reversible. In the name of the Thesari Dominion, by the authority of conquest doctrine that has governed the civilized galaxy for 6,000 years, you are hereby classified as hostile combatants. All weapons are cleared to fire. All commanders have authorization for maximum force. May your debris serve as a marker for others who consider defiance. The channel closed. The bridge was silent. I watched Graves. He stood very still, and in his eyes I saw something I had never seen before in all the years I had served with him. Not fear, not anger, not determination. Sorrow. Deep, genuine sorrow. The sorrow of a man who understood that what was about to happen was a failure. Not a military failure, a civilizational failure. The failure of patience and diplomacy, and 40 years of extending a hand that no one wanted to take. They really do not know, he said quietly, almost to himself. They have no idea what is about to happen. No, sir, I said, they do not. He turned to the main display. The Thesari fleet filled the screen now, close enough that individual ships were visible as distinct shapes against the star field, their running lights blinking in formation patterns that communicated readiness and intent. Beautiful. In a terrible way. 4,000 instruments of war, arranged with geometric precision, bearing down on us with the absolute confidence of a civilization that had never imagined a universe in which they were not the strongest thing in the room. Hold fire, Graves said. Let them shoot first. Let them fire everything they have. I want the recording to be absolutely clear. We did not start this. We did not escalate this. We stood here, and we waited, and we gave them every chance to turn around. Laura's hands hovered over her console. Understood, sir. Weapons on standby. Ready on your command and not a moment before. The first salvo came in like a wall of light. I had studied Thesari weapons technology for nearly a decade, and I knew in clinical detail what each of their systems was designed to do. Their primary batteries fired concentrated plasma bolts that could slag a capital ship's armor in sustained bursts. Superheated matter compressed to stellar core temperatures and accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed. Their secondary systems launched guided antimatter warheads, each one carrying enough destructive energy to crack a small moon, guided by targeting systems that could track a vessel through faster-than-light transitions. Their tertiary arrays projected focused graviton beams that could twist and tear hull plating like wet paper, exploiting the fundamental force of gravity itself as a weapon. Together, deployed simultaneously from 4,000 ships, they represented the most concentrated application of destructive force that had ever been aimed at a single target in the recorded history of the galaxy. Not the recorded history of the Thesari, the recorded history of everyone. Every species, every civilization, every war that had ever been fought since the first alien species looked up at the stars and decided to claim them. Nothing in 12,000 years of galactic military history compared to what was now being directed at us. The bridge viewports polarized instantly to maximum as the incoming fire lit up the space around us like a second sun. The tactical display became a solid wall of orange and red impact markers, so dense that individual readings merged into a continuous field of color. Every alarm on the ship activated simultaneously. And then, one by one, fell silent as the automated systems registered that no damage threshold was being reached and concluded there was nothing to alarm about. I gripped my console and braced for something. An impact, a shudder, the scream of hull plating under stress, the tremor that comes when enormous forces meet solid matter. Something. Nothing happened. The ship did not shake. The lights did not flicker. The temperature did not change. The artificial gravity did not waver. The coffee cup on the edge of Peter's console did not move. The only perceptible effect was that the hum of the power core beneath our feet deepened slightly, the way a large animal's breathing deepens when it is being fed, and even that was subtle enough that you might have imagined it if you were not listening carefully. Daniel's engineering readout painted the story in numbers I read 3 times because the first 2 times I did not believe them. Every joule of energy that the Thesari fleet was pouring into us was being absorbed by the hull, channeled through the exotic matter lattice, fed into the power core, and converted to stored potential energy. The most devastating barrage in galactic military history was, from our ship's perspective, a warm meal, a light snack, barely worth noting. "Core output rising," Daniel reported, and his voice was steady, but I could see his hands trembling on the console, not from fear but from the sheer cognitive dissonance of watching his instruments tell him something that his experience said was impossible. "We are up to 8%, 9. Their sustained fire is feeding us faster than our baseline consumption. Captain, they are literally charging our weapon for us." Owen let out a sound that was half laugh, half something else, something that did not have a name because humans are not accustomed to the emotion that comes from realizing you are invulnerable, and that the realization changes nothing about the moral weight of what you are about to do. "Shields are not even active. We do not need them. The hull is handling everything. I am reading 0 structural stress, 0 thermal variance, 0 anything." On the tactical display, the Thesari fire continued, wave after wave, every ship in the fleet, contributing to the barrage with everything they had. I imagined the view from their perspective. Thousands of weapons pouring fire into a single target, continuous streams of plasma and antimatter and focused gravity, enough destructive energy to strip the atmosphere from a planet, and their target was not responding, was not reacting, was not showing any sign that it was even aware it was being hit. "They are increasing output," Peter said, his eyes fixed on his console. "Reserve batteries are engaging across the fleet. I am seeing power spikes on ships that have not fired yet. They are throwing everything they have. Every weapon, every reserve, every backup system." "Let them," Graves said. He had not moved from his chair. His voice was perfectly level. "Let them expend everything. Let them empty every magazine and drain every power cell. I want them to know, when this is over, that it was not because they did not try hard enough." The barrage intensified. The space around us became so saturated with weapons fire that our sensors could not differentiate individual impacts anymore. The entire electromagnetic spectrum was flooded. If someone had been watching from a distance, they would have seen a sphere of white-hot energy, centered on a dark shape that sat in the middle of it, motionless and untouched, like a stone in the center of a furnace. 3 minutes passed. 5, 10. The hull temperature did not change. The structural readings did not waver. We sat in the center of a storm that could have leveled a continent, and we were untouched. More than untouched. We were growing stronger with every passing second. I watched the energy absorption readings climb, and I thought about what Simon had said about the power core operating at 6%. We were now at 14% and rising, fed entirely by enemy fire. The numbers meant something that I did not want to think about too carefully. If the weapon could do what Simon described at 6% power, and we were now at 14 and climbing, then the potential yield of a single shot had more than doubled since the battle began. The Thesari were not fighting us. They were arming us. Every shot they fired made the thing they were trying to destroy more capable of destroying them. Helen Wright came up from medical and stood at the rear of the bridge, watching the viewports with an expression of professional detachment that I knew was carefully maintained. "Any casualties?" she asked. "None," Owen said. "Not a scratch, not a bruise, not a stub toe." Helen nodded and went back to medical. There was nothing for her to do. There might never be anything for her to do, and that thought was both comforting and disturbing in equal measure. Finally, after 17 minutes of sustained fire that represented more destructive energy than most civilizations generated in a standard year, the barrage slowed, faltered, stopped, the sensors cleared, the viewports depolarized. The space around us returned to the normal darkness of the void, scattered with stars and the distant glow of planets, as if nothing had happened. And there we sat, exactly where we had been, without a scratch, without a mark, without a scuff on the hull, or a flicker in the lights, or any evidence that anything had happened at all, except for Daniel's power core readings, which now showed 19% capacity, and still climbing with residual absorption as the last traces of weapons energy dissipated against our hull. The silence on the bridge was absolute. Catherine looked up from her console, her face pale but her voice controlled. I am monitoring Thesari fleet communications, intercepting cross-ship traffic on their tactical frequencies. She paused, listening. They are confused, Captain. Multiple ships are requesting confirmation that their weapons actually fired. Battery commanders are running diagnostics on their targeting systems, assuming malfunction. The flagship is demanding sensor verification from the entire formation. They think their weapons did not work. Their weapons worked perfectly, Simon said softly. He was staring at his displays with an expression that looked almost like pity, the way you might look at someone who has just run full speed into a wall they could not see. Every shot hit us. Every warhead detonated against our hull. Every beam connected. Their weapons functioned exactly as designed. They simply encountered something that their design parameters did not account for. Their entire technological paradigm is based on the application of force. Greater force overcomes lesser force. That is the axiom their civilization is built on. They genuinely cannot comprehend a material that does not resist force but rather incorporates it. They are not equipped to process what just happened because processing it would require them to abandon the foundational assumption of their entire scientific framework. He took off his glasses and cleaned them, put them back on. They will figure it out eventually. But right now, in this moment, they are looking at their sensor data, and their minds are rejecting what it tells them, because accepting it would mean accepting that everything they believe about physics is incomplete. And that is a very hard thing for any mind to do. Graves sat still for 30 seconds. I counted them. In those 30 seconds, he was making the decision that would define human history. Not whether to fire. That decision had been made months ago, in quiet rooms on Earth, by people whose names would never appear in any record. The decision he was making now was narrower and more terrible. He was deciding who to hit. Laura, he said, target the flagship. Targeting cone narrow. I want the Throne of Silence and its immediate escort screen. Nothing else. Thread the cone through the densest part of their formation, and hit only the command cluster. Every other ship in that fleet goes home. Laura's fingers moved across her console with surgical precision. Targeting parameters set. Cone narrowed to 400-meter spread at focal point, expanding to approximately 3 kilometers at maximum range. I have the flagship and approximately 48 surrounding vessels in the targeting field. 37 escorts and 11 capital ships, plus the Throne of Silence itself. 48, Graves repeated. 48 ships, sir, including 12 super-capital class vessels. The remaining 4,165 vessels are outside the cone. Crew complement of the targeted vessels, I answered, because that was my department, and because my voice worked on autopilot, even when my mind wanted to crawl into a corner and hide. Approximately 300,000 total crew, across all 48 ships. 90,000 on the Throne of Silence alone. Graves closed his eyes. I watched his face and I saw the weight of what he was about to do press down on him like gravity doubling, tripling, becoming something that bowed the shoulders and aged the face, and carved lines that would never smooth. This was not a man who wanted to fire. This was a man who had spent his entire career hoping he would never have to, who had supported every diplomatic initiative, who had argued in closed sessions that humanity should exhaust every possible alternative before resorting to the weapon they had built. He had been a vocal advocate for patience, for negotiation, for one more try, one more conversation, one more attempt to find common ground. But patience requires a partner. Negotiation requires a counterpart who believes negotiation is possible, and the Thesari did not believe. They believed in force, and they had brought 4,000 ships worth of it to our doorstep, and they had fired everything they had, and now they sat in the void waiting to see why it had not worked, and the only answer we could give them was the one they had made inevitable. He opened his eyes. Fire. Laura pressed a single key. What happened next lasted 11 seconds. I know this because I checked the recording afterward, many times, frame by frame, second by second. trying to understand what I had witnessed with the desperate precision of someone trying to hold water in their hands. But 11 seconds is a clinical measurement. In the moment, time did something strange. It stretched and folded and became unreliable, as if the weapon's effect on molecular bonds extended to the bonds between moments, loosening them, letting them drift apart like everything else it touched. The weapon port opened. A single aperture on the forward hull, perhaps 20 meters across, ringed with a faint luminescence that was not light in any spectrum my eyes were built to process. From it came something that was not a beam, and not a projectile, and not energy in any form that physics had a name for. It was a line of something that my visual cortex could not process, and my instruments could not classify, and my language could not describe except through negation, by listing the things it was not. It was not light. It was not dark. It was not any color that has a name in any language. It was the absence of the space where color would normally exist. Looking at it felt like looking at a seam in the world, a place where reality had been carefully folded back to reveal what was underneath, and what was underneath was a blankness so total and so complete that my eyes could not find a surface to focus on. They slid off it the way water slides off glass. The line connected our weapon port to the Thesari flagship instantly. There was no travel time. There was no beam propagation. There was no moment between firing and impact. One frame of the recording showed empty space between us and the target. The next frame showed the line already in place, connecting us to them, as if the distance between us and the Throne of Silence had temporarily ceased to exist, and the two ships occupied the same point in space for the briefest of instants. The Throne of Silence did not explode. I need to be very clear about this because the distinction matters. It matters more than anything else in this account. It matters more than the politics and the diplomacy and the strategic implications and the 40 years of history that led to this moment. The largest warship in galactic history did not blow up. It did not shatter. It did not burn. It did not suffer any kind of violent destruction. There was no fireball, no shockwave, no debris field, no flash of light, no sound, though sound does not carry in space anyway. What it did was come apart, quietly, completely, with a precision that was somehow more horrifying than any explosion could have been, because explosions are chaotic and this was not. This was orderly. This was gentle. This was the most controlled and deliberate act of disassembly I had ever witnessed, performed on a scale that defied comprehension. The molecular bonds that held the ship's structure together released, not ruptured, not broken, released, as if every atom in that massive vessel had been individually and gently told that it no longer needed to hold hands with its neighbors, and every atom had listened. The strong nuclear force, the electromagnetic force, the quantum bonds that held matter together in the specific configurations that we call steel and circuitry, and flesh and bone, simply stopped asserting themselves within the targeting field. Not because they were overpowered, because they were persuaded. The ship did not fragment into pieces. It dissolved into particles, trillions upon trillions of component atoms, drifting apart in a slow, expanding cloud that caught the distant sunlight and glittered like dust motes in a cathedral. The hull did not peel away in sheets. The engines did not crack and separate. The compartments did not decompress and scatter. Everything became particles at the same moment, with the same quiet inevitability, as if the ship had exhaled and simply forgotten to hold itself together. The escorts went the same way. 47 additional ships, each one crewed by thousands of Thesari soldiers, who had woken up that morning confident in their invincibility, each one dissolving with the same terrible gentleness. The clouds of particles mingled and merged, creating a vast shimmering haze in the space where moments ago there had been warships and weapons and living beings who believed in their own supremacy. 48 ships, gone, not destroyed, not defeated, unmade, returned to the basic components from which they had been built, as if the universe had simply revoked the permissions that allowed them to be complex structures and required them to return to being simple matter. And the remaining fleet, over 4,100 vessels, drifted in formation, unharmed, untouched. The targeting cone had threaded through the densest part of their formation with surgical precision, dissolving the command cluster and leaving everything else exactly as it was. Ships that had been meters from the edge of the targeting field sat in perfect condition, their crews alive, their systems operational, their hulls unmarked. The weapon could have been aimed wider, could have been aimed at everything, could have turned 4,000 ships into atoms as easily as it had turned 48. The narrowness of the targeting was not a limitation. It was a choice. A deliberate, calculated, merciful choice. The line vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. The weapon port closed, the aperture sealed, and the Dreadnought sat in silence, and nothing moved. And the only evidence that anything had happened was a slowly expanding cloud of atomic dust where the heart of the Thessari fleet had been, glittering in the light of a star that had witnessed the birth of a species, and was now witnessing the birth of a new era. I became aware that I was not breathing. I forced air into my lungs, and it tasted like copper. Around me, the bridge crew sat frozen at their stations, each one wearing the same expression. It was the expression of people who have just seen something that their minds were not designed to contain. Something that exceeded the parameters of their experience so completely that the experience itself felt foreign, as if they were remembering someone else's memory rather than living their own. Laura had her hands flat on her console, and she was staring at them as if she had never seen hands before. Peter was gripping the edge of his navigation station so hard that I could hear the composite material creaking. Owen had leaned back in his chair and was looking at the ceiling. Catherine had one hand pressed over her mouth. Daniel, down in engineering, was silent on the intercom for the first time since I had known him. Simon was the only one who moved. He removed his glasses, cleaned them methodically on the hem of his shirt, put them back on, and said, very quietly, "It worked." 2 words, spoken by the man who had spent 20 years developing the theoretical framework for a weapon that had just unmade 48 warships in 11 seconds. It worked, as if he had been testing a recipe, as if the outcome had been uncertain. And maybe it had been. Maybe, despite all the simulations and the models and the mathematics, there had been a part of Simon that wondered whether reality would cooperate with his equations or rebel against them. It worked. The universe had done what the math predicted. The math was right, and 300,000 beings were now component atoms drifting in a cloud of glittering dust. I looked at the tactical display. The 48 red markers were gone. In their place was nothing. Not debris fields, not escape pods, not emergency beacons, not distress signals, nothing. The sensors registered the particle cloud as background matter, indistinguishable from any other dust in the solar system. The ships had not been destroyed in any way that left evidence of their existence. They had simply been returned to a state of fundamental simplicity that predated their construction. Graves sat in his command chair, and he did not move, and he did not speak for a very long time. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet. "Catherine," he said, "transmit the following on all frequencies. 1 word, same format as before." "Ready, sir." He paused, drew a breath, and then he said it, in a voice that carried no triumph, no satisfaction, no anger, no pride. Just a quiet, tired finality. The voice of a man who had just done something terrible and necessary, and who wanted it to be over. "Enough." Catherine sent it. 1 word, broadcast to every ship in the fleet, every relay in the corridor, every conclave frequency in the galaxy. Enough. Not a threat, not a demand, a statement, a boundary. This is where it stops. This is where the pushing ends. This is where 4,000 ships either turn around and go home, or learn what 48 ships learned in 11 seconds. The Thessari fleet did not retreat immediately. They did not fire. They did not maneuver. They did not do anything. 4,165 warships sat motionless in the void, weapons cold, engines at idle, drifting in the formation they had held during the barrage. Every individual ship commander, independently, without orders from a command structure that no longer existed, had arrived at the same conclusion, in the same moment. There was nothing to fight. There had never been anything to fight. There was only something to survive. Margaret Shaw appeared on the bridge. She walked to the viewport and looked out at the dispersing cloud that had been 48 warships, and she said nothing for what felt like a very long time. Her reflection in the glass was still. Her hands were clasped in front of her. She was watching 300,000 lives become dust, and she was bearing witness, because someone had to. "How many?" she said. "Approximately 300,000, I said. 300,000 Thessari crew across the 48 vessels. She nodded. One small movement of her head that contained more grief than most people express in a lifetime. "Captain Graves," she said, turning from the viewport, "begin transmitting our standard diplomatic hail to the remaining fleet. Offer assistance with navigation if they wish to withdraw from the system. Offer medical aid if any vessel needs it. Offer communication relay access so they can contact their government and their families. Make the offers genuine. Make them warm. and keep making them until someone responds. Graves looked at her. "Ma'am, we just ended any possibility of them threatening us," she said. "Now we need to begin the much harder work of showing them that ending the threat was not the same thing as ending the relationship. That is not optional. That is not a suggestion. That is an order from the ranking officer of the Terran Defense Authority." Catherine began transmitting, and her voice was steady and clear and carried no trace of triumph or hostility. It was the voice of someone extending a hand to people who had just watched their commanders vanish into nothing, and it went out across the void to 4,000 ships full of beings who had come to destroy us, and were now being offered help by the thing they could not destroy. None of them responded, not immediately, but none of them fired either. And in that silence, in that fragile, uncertain space between what had happened and what would happen next, something shifted. Not a physical shift, something deeper, something in the structure of assumptions that had governed the galaxy for 12,000 years. It's a recalibration so fundamental that the ripple effects would take years to manifest, and when they did, nothing would look the same. I sat at my console and I stared at the empty space where 48 ships had been, and I tried to feel something clean. Pride, maybe. Relief. Vindication. Something that would make what we had done feel like a victory rather than a wound. But the only thing I felt was a bone-deep weariness and a sadness that I could not shake, because we had won, and winning had cost us the thing we valued most. The Thesari fleet remained motionless for 6 hours. 6 hours of absolute silence on every communication channel. 6 hours during which over 4,000 warships sat in the void like statues, their weapons dark and their engines cold, while somewhere in the command structure of each vessel, officers and crew members tried to process what they had seen, and failed and tried again, and failed again. I monitored their internal communications where I could intercept them, and what I heard was not anger, not fear, not the sharp, efficient chatter of a military force regrouping for a counterattack. It was confusion, deep, structural, existential confusion. The kind that happens when the floor you have been standing on your entire life turns out to be a ceiling, and you realize you have no idea which way is down. Finally, the fleet began to withdraw. Not as a coordinated retreat, not as a strategic withdrawal executed with military precision. Individual ships, one by one, turning and accelerating toward the outer system, heading for the same jump points they had used to arrive. Some went quickly, engines at full power, as if fleeing from something they did not want to look at anymore. Some moved slowly, almost reluctantly, as if they were afraid that moving too fast might attract attention, might draw the eye of the silent dark ship that sat between the planets with a weapon that could undo them. A few lingered at the edge of sensor range for hours after the rest had gone, watching us, recording us, trying to gather some scrap of data, some piece of information, some fragment of understanding that might help them explain to their superiors and their families and themselves what had happened. We let them go, every single one. We tracked them to the system boundary and beyond, and we did not raise a weapon, did not power a targeting system, did not transmit a warning or a threat or a reminder. We just watched. And when the last Thesari signature faded from our sensors and the solar system was empty again except for us and the cloud of atoms that had been a fleet's heart, Graves stood up from his command chair and rubbed his face with both hands and said, "Stand down from battle stations. All departments, begin after-action reporting. Get some rest if you can, and somebody please make some coffee, because this is going to be a very long night." I wanted to laugh. I wanted to cry. I did neither. I wrote my initial report in a tone of clinical detachment that felt like a betrayal of everything I had just experienced. I drank bad coffee. I sat in my quarters and stared at the bulkhead and tried to reconcile the fact that I was alive with the fact that 300,000 beings were not, and both of those facts were the direct result of the same 11 seconds. Eventually, the lights automatically dimmed for the ship's night cycle, and I stared at the bulkhead in the dark, and I thought about what we had done, and what it meant, and whether the universe was a better place now, or a worse one, and I could not decide, and the uncertainty was the most honest thing I had felt all day. I found Laura in the weapons bay the next morning. She was sitting on the floor beside her console, her back against the wall, her legs stretched out in front of her. She was staring at her hands. She had been there for hours, one of the junior officers told me quietly. She had not moved. She had not spoken to anyone. She had just been sitting there, looking at the hand that pressed the key. I sat down beside her. The floor was cold. The weapons bay was always cold. Something about the energy conduits that fed the primary system drawing ambient heat from the surrounding compartments. It felt appropriate. I pressed one key, she said without looking at me. One key. I have trained for 12 years. I have run 10,000 simulations. I have maintained this weapon system through every diagnostic cycle, and every calibration check, and every incremental upgrade. I know its specifications better than I know my own name, and when the moment came, it was one key, one press of one finger, and 300,000 lives ended. I did not say anything for a long time. There was nothing to say that would not sound hollow. No comfort that would not feel like a lie. She had done her duty. She had followed a lawful order in defense of her species. Every ethical framework, every legal standard, every moral calculus you could apply agreed that what she did was justified, and none of that mattered to the part of her that was sitting on the floor of a cold room, looking at the finger that had pressed the key. You did not start this, Laura. I know that. Her voice was flat, drained of everything except the raw fact of what she was saying. The Thesari started it. The galaxy's power structure started it. 12,000 years of civilizations measuring each other by how much they could break started it. I just ended it. I just happened to be the one sitting in the chair when the ending needed to happen. She finally looked at me. Her eyes were dry. People who have done what she did do not cry immediately. The tears come later, weeks or months later, when the reality has had time to seep through the layers of training and duty and adrenaline and settle in the part of the mind that still counts in human terms. Does it help? She asked, knowing that there was no other way. No, I said, it does not help at all. No, it does not. We sat on the cold floor of the weapons bay, and we did not speak, and we did not comfort each other, because there was no comfort to be had. There was only the knowledge that we had done what needed to be done, and that needing to do it did not make it weigh any less. I found Owen that evening in the observation lounge, standing at the viewport with a glass of something amber that he was not drinking. He was watching the space where the fleet had been. There was nothing to see anymore. The particle cloud had dispersed beyond visual resolution hours ago, but he was watching anyway. I was tactical officer on the most powerful warship ever built, he said, and I had nothing to do. My entire department, all of our defensive systems, our countermeasures, our electronic warfare suites, everything I have trained for, and everything my team has spent years perfecting, was irrelevant. We did not need evasive maneuvers. We did not need point defense. We just sat there and absorbed the most devastating attack in galactic history, and it did not even register as an inconvenience. He turned the glass in his hands. Do you know what the most unsettling part is? It is not the weapon. The weapon is terrifying, but it is at least comprehensible as a weapon. It does something. I can categorize it. I can put it in a box in my mind labeled things that end other things. But the hull is something else entirely. The hull is passive. It does not fight back. It does not reflect or deflect or resist. It just accepts. Everything they threw at us, every joule of energy, it simply took in and made part of itself. That is not defense. That is not even technology. Not in any way I understand the word. That is a philosophy expressed in matter. And I am a tactical officer, and I do not know what to do with a philosophical statement. He set the glass down, still full, and walked away. I stayed at the viewport, and I watched the empty void, and I thought about how strange it was that the most powerful warship in history was crewed by people who would have given anything to never use it. The next morning, life aboard the Dreadnought resumed its routines with the careful deliberateness of people rebuilding normalcy from broken pieces. Crew members ate breakfast. They ran diagnostics. They filed reports and attended briefings and made small talk in the corridors. The normalcy felt fragile, like a glass figurine being handled by hands that had just been reminded of their own strength. But it held, because that is what humans do. We keep going. We eat breakfast the morning after the world changes, and we wash the dishes, and we show up for our shifts, because the alternative is to sit on the floor of the weapons bay forever, and that helps no one. Helen Wright, our medical officer, came to see me in my quarters later that day. She closed the door and sat down across from me and said, I need to talk to you about the crew. What about them? Nobody came to medical, not one person. After the engagement, after the withdrawal, after all of it, not a single crew member has reported to medical for any reason. No anxiety, no insomnia, no requests for sedatives or counseling. Nothing. Maybe they are handling it. Nobody handles something like this silently and cleanly. Nobody. They are containing it. They are compartmentalizing. And compartmentalization works right up until the moment it stops working. And when it stops working, it stops all at once. She folded her hands on her knees. I have served on 6 ships in 20 years. I have been through combat deployments, first contact scenarios, quarantine lockdowns, and a radiation accident that killed 3 of my patients. None of those prepared me for a crew that fires a weapon that dissolves 300,000 people and then goes to bed and gets up and eats breakfast like it was a training exercise. What do you want me to do? I want you to pay attention. Watch them. Not clinically. As a friend. As a shipmate. If someone starts cracking, I need to know before the crack becomes a collapse. This crew is holding it together right now through sheer discipline and stubbornness, and those are fine materials for building a wall, but walls built on discipline and stubbornness tend to come down all at once when they come down. I told her I would watch. I told her I would pay attention, and I did. In the days and weeks that followed, I watched my crewmates carry the weight of what we had done, with a quiet steadiness that was as admirable as it was concerning. Because Helen was right. Nobody talked about it. Nobody broke down. Nobody showed any outward sign of the impossible thing we had all participated in. We just kept going. Breakfast and diagnostics and reports and sleep. Over and over. The routine became a kind of armor, and we wore it every day, and underneath it the wound was still there, still raw, still waiting. The galactic reaction began before the Thesari fleet even cleared our sensor range, because the transmission we had sent, the single word, enough, had propagated across every relay in the communication network at the speed of light, hopping from node to node, amplified and redistributed by automated systems that treated it like any other diplomatic broadcast, and attached to that word, embedded in the signal metadata by our communication systems which had been programmed to document everything, was the unedited sensor recording of the engagement. Everything. The barrage that did not scratch us. The single shot. The 48 ships dissolving into atoms. 11 seconds of footage that would reshape the political landscape of a galaxy that had been organized around the same principles for 12,000 years. I did not learn about the broader reaction until days later, when our intelligence feeds began populating with reports from across known space. Claire Holloway, our ambassador at the conclave, sent back a series of dispatches that read like dispatches from a world that was coming apart at the seams. Not violently. The seams were just opening, quietly, as assumptions that had held for millennia dissolved under the weight of new information, much the way the Thesari ships had dissolved under the weight of new physics. The 5 pillar civilizations, the great powers that had governed the galactic order since before humanity learned to make fire, entered immediate crisis. Each one reacted differently, and each reaction revealed something fundamental about their character that decades of diplomacy had merely hinted at. The Thesari Dominion, already reeling from the loss of their supreme commander, and their flagship, and their fleet's command structure, fragmented within 72 hours. Regional commanders declared autonomous authority. Disputed border zones erupted in internal power struggles as subordinate officers who had spent their careers waiting for their chance at the top suddenly realized that the top was empty. The political entity that had terrorized half the galaxy for centuries was coming apart, not because we had destroyed it, but because we had destroyed the idea that held it together. The idea that strength was the only currency that mattered. We had demonstrated a strength so far beyond theirs that the concept of comparative strength itself collapsed. If power was a spectrum, and they were at one end, they had always assumed the other end was empty. Now they knew something sat at the far extreme, and the distance between their position and that extreme was so vast that their entire civilization's self-image, built on being the strongest, became meaningless. You cannot be the strongest when the strongest is someone else. And you cannot recover from that realization when your entire culture and identity and philosophy of existence is predicated on being at the top. The Velkari Concord went into what Claire described as existential paralysis. The oldest of the pillar civilizations, the one that prided itself on diplomatic sophistication and strategic foresight, the one that had maintained the galactic balance of power through careful manipulation and quiet management of information for longer than human civilization had existed, discovered that it had been irrelevant for 40 years without knowing it. Their entire strategic framework was built on the assumption that they understood the balance of power. They had charts, they had models, they had centuries of accumulated institutional knowledge about who was strong and who was weak, and how to play them against each other to maintain stability. In one engagement, without consulting them, without even acknowledging their existence, humanity had rendered their entire framework obsolete. The balance they had spent millennia maintaining was gone, replaced by something they could not categorize, could not influence, could not manage. For a civilization whose identity was built on being the smartest people in the room, discovering that they had not even understood the room was devastating. The Rithani collective mobilized their entire fleet, not against us, not against anyone in particular. They simply placed every warship they had on active alert and waited, because mobilization was the only response their institutional playbook contained for a strategic shock of this magnitude, and they did not have the institutional flexibility to improvise. Their ambassador to the conclave, the same one who had joked 40 years ago about letting the insects in, when humanity first appeared on the galactic stage, formally requested a full briefing from Claire. When told that the briefing would consist of the same recording he had already seen, he reportedly sat in silence for an hour. Then he asked to be recalled to his homeworld. He left the conclave station the next day and did not return. The Draconeth hegemony was the first to understand the true implications, because the Draconeth were, above all else, analytical. They did not panic. They did not posture. They did not mobilize or retreat or bluster. They sat down with the recording, and they studied it, frame by frame, with the focused intensity of a species that had survived 9,000 years, by understanding threats before the threats understood themselves. Their senior intelligence analyst, a veteran named Carl Soren, who had spent 60 years studying emerging civilizations and assessing potential dangers, produced an internal assessment that was leaked to our intelligence network within days. I read it in my quarters aboard the Dreadnought, sitting on my bunk with a cold cup of coffee balanced on my knee, and each paragraph hit me like a physical blow, because Soren had seen what I had been trying to articulate for years, and he had said it with a clarity that cut through every layer of obfuscation and denial, like the weapon itself. The assessment noted that the physics underlying the Terran weapon did not represent an incremental advancement in weapons technology. It did not represent a leap forward. It represented a paradigm shift so fundamental that it rendered the collective scientific understanding of every other civilization in the galaxy approximately 3,000 years obsolete. The weapon was not a better version of existing technology. It was not a more powerful beam or a more efficient warhead, or a more advanced application of known principles. It was the expression of an entirely different understanding of reality, a deeper understanding, a more complete picture of how the universe was assembled at the most fundamental level. Soren wrote that the Terrans had not built a better weapon. They had discovered a deeper layer of reality, and they had expressed that understanding in a form that happened to have military applications. But the military application was incidental. It was a side effect, a footnote. The real significance was what the weapon implied about Terran scientific capability. If they could selectively suspend the fundamental forces that held matter together, then they understood those forces at a level of completeness that made the galaxy's collective physics look like a child's drawing of the sun. And if they understood physics at that level, then the weapon was not the most impressive thing they could build. It was the most obvious thing, the simplest application, the first thing you would think of if you truly understood how matter worked and you needed to make a point quickly. But that was not the part that frightened Soren. The frightening part was buried in the middle of the assessment, presented with the clinical restraint of a professional who was trying very hard to maintain his composure while delivering news that he knew would restructure his civilization's understanding of its place in the universe. He had done the math. He had looked at the energy signatures that had been detected near Saturn 22 years ago, when humanity first began the construction phase of whatever they were building. He had worked backward from the capabilities demonstrated in the engagement. He had consulted with physicists across 3 civilizations and asked them to independently model the development curve that would be required to move from the galactic standard understanding of physics to the understanding implied by the weapon. They all converged on the same answer, and the answer was impossible. The theoretical framework required to build the weapon was not something that could be developed in 22 years, not in 100 years, not in 1,000, not by any known species working with any known resources under any known conditions. The development curve, even under the most generous assumptions, pointed to a body of foundational research that would have taken centuries to compile. Generations of theoretical work building on itself, each layer requiring the previous one to be fully understood before the next could be approached. Which meant one of 2 things. Either humanity had been working on this physics for far longer than any external intelligence service had estimated, implying a conspiracy of silence spanning their entire history as a spacefaring species, Or humanity had arrived at the theoretical foundation before they ever made first contact with the galactic community. Soren concluded it was the second option, and the implications of that conclusion shattered everything. It meant that when humanity first appeared at the Grand Conclave 40 years ago, in their battered colony transport with its mismatched hull plates and its engine signature, that nobody could properly classify, they already knew. They already had the theory. They already understood that the physics governing galactic technology was incomplete. They already possessed a scientific framework that surpassed anything else in the galaxy by 3 millennia. They came to the stars not as ignorant newcomers stumbling into a civilization they did not understand. They came as a species that had already surpassed everyone they would ever meet, and instead of leveraging that advantage, instead of conquering or manipulating or establishing dominance the way every other powerful civilization in galactic history had done without exception, they chose something else. They chose to ask about art. They chose to trade, to learn languages, to share meals, to build friendships with species that could not harm them, and could not help them, and had nothing to offer except themselves. They sent diplomats who listened. They sent scientists who asked questions they already knew the answers to, because they wanted to understand how other minds approached the same problems. They absorbed insults with grace. They responded to mockery with curiosity. They spent 40 years being dismissed and patronized and condescended to by civilizations that they could have unmade on the first day. And they did it with patience and warmth, and what appeared to be genuine enjoyment. Why? That was the question Soren could not answer. And it was the question that was now consuming every intelligence agency, every diplomatic corps, every strategic think tank, every philosophical society in the galaxy. Not what is the weapon, not how does it work, not how do we defend against it. Why did they wait? Why did they hide what they were? Why did they choose kindness when they had the power to choose absolutely anything? I read Soren's report 3 times. Then I requested a meeting with Simon. He met me in the science lab, surrounded by displays showing mathematical models that looked more like abstract art than equations, cascading structures of symbols and relationships that seemed to shift and reconfigure as I watched, as if the math itself was alive and thinking. He was eating a sandwich. The juxtaposition was entirely characteristic. "Simon," I said, "Soren's report, the timeline. He is right, is he not? We had the theory before first contact." Simon took a bite of his sandwich and chewed thoughtfully. He was not evading the question. He was thinking about how to answer it honestly, without drowning me in technical detail that would take years to explain properly. "We had pieces of it," he said. "The quantum field framework that underpins the weapon was first theorized in 2031, roughly 60 years before we made contact with the galactic community. A team at Cambridge published a paper that described a mathematical relationship between the fundamental forces that no one had noticed before. It was elegant, it was beautiful, and it suggested that the forces holding matter together were not intrinsic properties of matter itself, but emergent behaviors of a deeper underlying structure. Like waves on an ocean. The waves are real, but the ocean is the more fundamental thing." He set down his sandwich. By the time we met the Velkari, we had a working mathematical model of that deeper structure. Not a weapon, not even a technology, just an understanding, a very deep, very complete understanding of how the universe is assembled at a level below the one that everyone else was working at. We understood the ocean while everyone else was studying the waves. "And you never told anyone." "We told everyone." He said it simply, without emphasis, but the words carried a weight that pressed against my chest. "We published the math. Open source. Free access. Available in every academic archive we contributed to across a dozen civilizations. We submitted papers to the Velkari Academy of Physical Sciences, to the Rithani Institute of Fundamental Research, to the Draconeth Center for Theoretical Studies. We presented at conferences. We offered collaborative research programs. We practically begged someone to look at what we had found." He paused, and I saw something flicker across his face. Not anger. Disappointment. The particular disappointment of a scientist who has discovered something beautiful and cannot get anyone to see it. Nobody read it. Nobody could read it. The galactic scientific establishment is built on paradigms that are 12,000 years old. Those paradigms work. They produce reliable results. They predict outcomes accurately within their domain. But they are incomplete, and when we submitted papers that implied incompleteness, they were dismissed as errors. When we tried to present findings that contradicted established theory, we were told our methodology was flawed. When we offered to collaborate, we were politely but firmly redirected to introductory courses that would teach us the basics of proper physics. He picked up his sandwich again. We were not hiding our knowledge. That is the part nobody wants to hear. We were trying to share it. For 40 years we tried to give this understanding away to anyone who would take it. We tried to hand the galaxy the key to a deeper reality, free of charge, no strings attached, because we believed that knowledge shared makes everyone stronger. Nobody listened. Nobody could listen. Their entire scientific framework would have had to collapse first, and no civilization voluntarily collapses its own understanding of reality. It is too frightening, too disorienting. You would rather be wrong and stable than right and adrift. So we built the Dreadnought. So we built the Dreadnought. He said it with a tiredness that went deeper than physical fatigue. Not because we wanted to prove we were right. Not because we wanted to demonstrate superiority. Because we watched the Thesari expanding their territory year after year, annexing smaller civilizations, building toward something that we could see coming, even if no one else could. We saw the fleet mobilizations, the strategic posturing, the rhetoric about conquest doctrine and natural hierarchy, and we knew, with the certainty of a species that has watched its own worst impulses play out across centuries of bloody history, that when the time came, papers and presentations and polite scientific discourse would not stop 4,000 warships. He looked at me with something that might have been grief. We wanted to teach them. We tried to teach them. And instead, we had to show them. And showing is always uglier than teaching. Always. I sat with those words for a long time after I left the lab. I walked the corridors of the Dreadnought, this enormous silent ship that hummed with the energy of a captive singularity, and I thought about classrooms and battlefields and the distance between understanding and force, and how that distance was supposed to be the measure of a civilization's maturity. The diplomatic aftermath unfolded over weeks. Claire Holloway appeared at the conclave and delivered a statement that I watched from the Dreadnought's communications center, surrounded by crew members who had gathered in silence to hear what our ambassador would say to a galaxy that had just discovered it was not the biggest thing in the room. Claire stood at the speaking platform in the great hall of the conclave station, surrounded by delegations from over 200 civilizations, and she spoke with the same calm, measured warmth that she had carried for 4 decades. She was 58 years old. She had been humanity's voice in the galaxy since she was 18, starting as a junior cultural attaché and working her way up through every level of diplomatic service. She had been mocked to her face more times than she could count. She had been excluded from meetings, denied speaking time, seated at the back of the hall, assigned the smallest office, given the worst translation equipment. She had endured all of it with a patience that everyone attributed to meekness and no one attributed to strength. Now the hall was silent when she spoke. Every seat was filled. Every delegation was present. Every eye was on her. She said that the Terran Federation had no territorial ambitions beyond the systems we already occupied, that we sought no reparations from the Thesari Dominion or anyone else, that we wished to continue peaceful relations with all galactic civilizations on the same terms we had always offered, that the events in our solar system were a defensive action taken in response to an unprovoked military invasion, and that our preference, as it had always been, was for dialogue over confrontation, for cooperation over competition, for the slow, patient work of building understanding across the gaps between species. She said all of this while standing in a room full of beings who now knew that her species could dissolve their entire civilizations into component atoms, and the warmth in her voice did not waver. The kindness was not a mask. It was not a strategy. It was not a calculation. It was real. It had always been real. And that, I realized watching the faces of the delegates on the feed, was the most terrifying thing about it. Because kindness from the weak is expected. It costs nothing. It threatens nothing. It is simply the natural behavior of beings who have no other option. But kindness from the strong, real kindness, the kind that persists even after the strong have been given every reason to abandon it, that is something the galaxy had never encountered. It did not have a conceptual framework for processing generosity that came without conditions, from a power that could enforce any conditions it wished. Every civilization in that hall was accustomed to reading kindness as a transaction, as a strategic move in an endless game of leverage. They could not comprehend kindness as a principle, as a value, as something a civilization chose to embody not because it was useful, but because it was right, even when it was inconvenient, even when it was exploited, even when it was met with contempt. Claire's statement ended. The hall remained silent. No one applauded. No one protested. No one moved. They sat in the presence of something they could not categorize, and they did the only thing they could do, which was nothing at all. Over the following weeks, the overtures began, carefully, tentatively, like animals approaching water in a territory they no longer trusted. The Velkari ambassador requested a private audience with Claire. I was not present for the meeting, but Claire briefed me afterward over a secure channel, and I recorded every word because I knew that what she was telling me was not just diplomacy, it was history. The ambassador was a 200-year-old diplomat who had navigated galactic politics through 4 major conflicts and 11 minor ones, who had personally brokered the treaty that ended the last Great Pillar War, who was widely considered the most sophisticated political mind in the galaxy. He had spent his career understanding power and managing it and distributing it in ways that maintained stability, and he had been very good at his job. He asked Claire one question. It was the same question that Soren had failed to answer, the same question that was keeping every analyst in the galaxy awake at night. Why did you not conquer us when you could have? Claire's answer, as she related it to me, was simple and devastating. Because we have been conquerors before, we know what it costs. We know what it does to the conqueror as much as the conquered. We built empires on our own world that stretched across continents, and every single one of them crumbled, and every single one of them left scars that took centuries to heal. We learned, through more pain than you can imagine, that dominion is not strength. It is a trap that makes the powerful weak, and the weak resentful, and everyone miserable. We came to the stars hoping to find someone who had learned the same lesson. Instead, we found a galaxy that was still in the empire-building phase, still measuring value by territory and fleet size, and the ability to make others submit. And we thought, maybe we can show them. Maybe if we are patient enough, kind enough, open enough, they will see that there is another way. She paused. We were wrong. Not about the other way. There is another way. But we were wrong about how to demonstrate it. You cannot teach someone a lesson they are not ready to learn. All you can do is be there when they are ready, and hope that you have not been forced to do something unforgivable in the meantime. The ambassador reportedly sat in silence for a very long time after that. Then he said, "My species has existed for 9,000 years. In that time we have encountered 312 spacefaring civilizations. Every single one of them, upon achieving sufficient power, has used that power to dominate others. Every single one, without exception. You are the first. And I confess that I do not know whether that makes you the most admirable species I have ever met, or the most dangerous." Claire said, "Maybe both." In the months that followed, the galaxy reorganized itself around the new reality. The Thessari Dominion continued to fragment. The Velkari threw themselves into diplomatic outreach, with a fervor that bordered on desperation. The Rithani began a comprehensive review of their scientific foundations, pulling research from archives that had been sealed for millennia, searching for the seeds of the understanding that we had demonstrated. The Draconeth, practical as always, simply asked for a meeting, a real meeting. No posturing, no games, no political theater. Just 2 civilizations sitting down to talk honestly about what the universe looked like now that the old map had been burned. We said yes to all of it. Every overture, every request, every tentative handshake. We said yes, because that was what we had always wanted. Connection, understanding, partnership, the bigger table. But something had changed, and I could feel it in every interaction, every diplomatic exchange, every carefully worded message. The warmth was still there on our side. The openness was genuine, but the beings on the other side of the conversation were different now. They were afraid, not of an attack, not of a weapon. They were afraid of us, of what we were, of the gap between what we could do and what we chose to do, and the terrifying, vertiginous realization that the only thing standing between them and dissolution was our goodwill. They could not trust our kindness anymore, not because it was false, it was the most real thing about us, but because they now knew what it coexisted with. Every smile from a human diplomat carried the shadow of 48 ships turning to dust. Every handshake was extended by a species that could unmake the hand being offered. Every act of generosity was weighed, consciously or unconsciously, against the calculus of what it might cost to refuse it. And the calculation always ended in the same place. It ended in a cloud of atoms, glittering in the light of a distant star. Trust cannot survive that kind of knowledge. Not easily, maybe not ever. I watched this transformation with a growing sadness that I could not fully articulate, until one night, months after the engagement, when I sat alone in the observation lounge of the Dreadnought and looked out at the stars and finally understood what we had lost. We had lost the possibility of being met as equals. For 40 years, that was what we had worked toward. Not dominance, not submission, not even respect, though respect would have been nice. We wanted equality, the chance to sit at the table as one voice among many, valued not for our power, but for our ideas, not for what we could destroy, but for what we could create and share and build together with others. We had poured 4 decades of patient, genuine, open-hearted effort into constructing that possibility, brick by brick, conversation by conversation, smile by smile, insult absorbed by insult absorbed. And the Thesari had forced us to destroy it in 11 seconds. Because you cannot be equals with someone who is afraid of you. You cannot build a partnership on a foundation of fear. You cannot have an honest conversation with someone who is calculating the odds of their survival every time you open your mouth. The power imbalance that we had spent 40 years trying to render irrelevant was now the only thing anyone could see, a shadow that fell across every interaction, every exchange, every moment of contact between us and the rest of the galaxy. And no amount of kindness, no amount of patience, no amount of diplomatic skill or cultural exchange or scientific collaboration could make them unsee what they had seen. The recording existed, the dust cloud existed, the knowledge existed, and knowledge, once gained, cannot be ungained, not by anyone, not ever. I thought about Claire Holloway, standing in the great hall of the conclave, offering friendship to a room full of beings who could no longer see her as anything other than a representative of the thing that could end them. I thought about her patience, 40 years of it, spent building bridges that were now too shadowed by the weapon to be crossed without fear. I thought about what it must have cost her to keep smiling, to keep extending the hand, to keep being warm and genuine and kind when she knew, as we all knew, that the warmth would never be received the same way again. And I thought about the question the Velkari ambassador had asked. Why did you not conquer us when you could have? And Claire's answer, because we did not like what it made us. And I thought about what this had made us. Not conquerors. Something worse, in a way. Something the galaxy had no word for. A species that could end everything, and chose not to, and could not prove that the choice would hold. A power so absolute that even our mercy was terrifying, because mercy from the omnipotent is indistinguishable from patience, and patience from the omnipotent is indistinguishable from a timer that has not yet run out. The Dreadnought orbited Saturn in silence. It had no name. We had never given it one. Names are for things you want to be known, and we built this ship hoping it would never be known, hoping it would sit in the dark between our planets forever, a silent guardian that would never need to speak. But it spoke. 11 seconds of speech, and now everyone knew what it could say, and nothing we could do would make them unhear it. I sat at my desk in the dim light of ship's night cycle, and I began writing this account, because I believed that someone, somewhere, at some point in the future, needed to understand what actually happened. Not the weapon, not the battle, not the political fallout and the diplomatic reshuffling and the strategic realignment of galactic power structures, but the thing underneath all of it. The thing that mattered more than physics, and more than politics, and more than the 11 seconds that changed everything. We came to the stars with open hands. We spent 40 years trying to show the galaxy that power does not have to mean domination, that strength does not have to mean cruelty, that the biggest thing in the room does not have to be the most dangerous thing in the room. We tried to demonstrate, through 4 decades of patience and kindness and genuine effort, that a civilization could be both mighty and gentle, both capable and compassionate, both strong enough to end worlds and kind enough to sit across a table and learn about your art and your music and your philosophy and mean it. And the galaxy responded by sending 4,000 warships to our door and forcing us to prove our point in the worst possible way. The weapon was never the story. The weapon was the failure of the story. It was the failure of every other possible narrative, the one where we were heard, the one where we were understood, the one where the papers were read and the science was shared and the bigger table was built and nobody had to learn anything through violence. The weapon existed because every one of those better stories was rejected by a galaxy that could not imagine a civilization that was both powerful and kind. And so it pushed and pushed and pushed, until kindness had to step aside and let power speak, because power was the only language anyone was willing to hear. We did not want to speak that language. We never did. Every word of it tastes like ash. Every syllable carries the weight of 300,000 lives that did not need to end. Every echo of that single shot reverberates through the corridors of this nameless ship, and through the halls of the conclave, and through the intelligence agencies and the war rooms and the diplomatic chambers of a galaxy that finally understands what we were trying to tell them for 40 years. But they understood too late. Not too late to survive. They survived. We made sure of that. We aimed narrow when we could have aimed wide. We said enough when we could have said nothing and fired again. We offered navigation assistance and medical aid and communication access to the fleet that came to destroy us, and we meant every word of it. We would always have made sure they survived, because that is who we are, and that is the choice we made, and no amount of provocation will change it. Too late to have met us as equals. Too late to have taken the hand that was offered freely and openly for 4 decades. Too late to have read the papers and engaged with the science, and built the collaborative future that we spent 40 years trying to construct. Too late to have known us as the people we wanted to be, instead of the thing we were forced to become. Too late to have been our friends. I close this account with a single thought. Somewhere right now, as I write these words, the Dreadnought orbits Saturn in silence. Its weapon is idle. Its crew is alive. Its corridors are warm and lit, and filled with people who would rather talk than fight, who would rather build than destroy, who would rather sit across a table from you and learn about your art, than sit behind a weapon port and learn about your breaking point. The hand is still open. It has always been open. It will always be open, because that is the promise we made to ourselves when we left Earth, and that is the promise we intend to keep, even if no one else believes it, even if the shadow of what we did makes every gesture of friendship look like a threat to those who receive it. The galaxy just needs to find the courage to take it, and I hope, with every fiber of my fragile, stubborn, impossibly optimistic human heart, that someday they will. Because hope is the most human thing there is. More human than the weapon. More human than the physics. More human than the ship or the shot or the silence that followed. Hope is what we carried to the stars, and it is what we will carry forward into whatever comes next, even if what comes next is a galaxy that flinches every time we smile. We hope, and we wait, and the hand stays open. That is the story. Not of a weapon fired, but of a bridge burned. Not of a battle won, but of a friendship lost before it could begin. Not of a galaxy that learned to fear us, but of a galaxy that never learned to know us, and by the time it tried, the knowing came wrapped in the memory of dust. This is what I wanted someone to understand. Not what we did, but what we lost. And if you are reading this, whoever you are, whatever species you belong to, whatever you think you know about the Terrans and their nameless ship and their impossible weapon, I ask you to consider one thing. We built the weapon because we had to. We fired the weapon because we had no choice. But we built the bridges first. We tried the bridges first. And if you come to us, even now, even after everything, with an open hand and an honest voice, you will find that the bridges are still there. Burned, yes. Shadowed, yes. Harder to cross than they would have been if things had gone differently, yes. But still there. We built them to last. We are very good at building things that last.